The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Contained herein are the heresies of Radolf Buntwine, erstwhile monk turned traveling medical investigator. Join me as I study the secrets of the divine plagues and uncover the blasphemous truth that ours is not a loving God, and we are not its favored children. The heresies of Radolf Buntwine, wherever podcasts are available.
Hello, welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and today we have a very special guest who is Daphne Palmer Geanacopoulos, author of a book that just came out called The Pirate's Wife, The Remarkable True Story of Sarah Kidd. And so she is going to join me to help share the story of Sarah Kidd, who is married to the famous pirate Captain Kidd, who you might have heard about. It's a really interesting story, and I hope you enjoy this talk with Daphne Palmer Geanacopoulos. Okay, so I'm joined today by Daphne Palmer Geanacopoulos, author of The Pirate's Wife, The Remarkable True Story of Sarah Kidd. Welcome, Daphne.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I think I'm really excited to get to learn more about your book and also about Sarah Kidd. But my first question is how, this is a whole book just about Sarah Kidd, who is the wife of Captain Kidd. We're going to talk about that. How did you come across enough information to write a whole book about her?
Well, I first got interested in pirates when I wrote a freelance piece for the New York Times Museum special section about the Witta Pirate Museum in Provincetown. And when I saw the artifacts of the pirates, I realized that they had lives and connections on land. And the legend of the captain of the Witta pirate ship, Sam Bellamy, had a love interest, Maria Hallett. And that told me that pirates might have families and communities. And I hadn't thought about that before. So in the course of writing my first book, The Pirate Next Door, the untold story of 18th century pirates' wives, families, and communities, I learned about Sarah Kidd, and I knew that she would be worth a deeper look.
And so what sorts of resources did you have to learn about her?
I used a variety of sources because women left little record of their affairs. Mm-hmm. Most women, including Sarah, were illiterate because men all owned all the property and exercised most of the legal rights at the time. And history was written by men for men. In order to explore Sarah's life, I read a lot of contextual history of pirates and of the time period, which gave me the broad scope of the economic, political, and social conditions under which she lived in. And I was able to find some important primary sources of Sarah's that she left. And for example, her petition to the governor of Massachusetts, Lord Belmont, and asking him to give her back her seized property. And she left a will and a number of other things. There was a lot of land transactions and genealogical information. Many of the ancient sources that I relied on were handwritten, and I transcribed them to make them easier to work with.
Mm-hmm.
I also visited the archives in the places where Sarah and Captain Kidd had lived. Those were in New York and Boston and Rhode Island. And I walked the surroundings where she had been to get a greater sense of her world at the time. I also found some really great resources at the National Archives in London, among the Admiralty papers, and at the Library of Congress in Washington. And Captain Kidd also left statements, recorded statements that gave evidence of their relationship.
So, can you contextualize if we're just kind of starting at the very beginning of the story? So, Sarah, it starts with she's a young teenager and she immigrates over. So, what was the reason her family came over to the United States?
She was 14 years old when she came from England to New York with her father and two brothers. The reason they came was to get a fresh start, in the new world and opportunities. Her father was a mariner and he owned transatlantic vessels. So trade was booming in Manhattan, and he came for those economic advantages.
Sorry, and can you just contextualize just for the listeners, what year is this? What era are we looking at?
So she arrived in 1684 at the age of 14.
And then pretty quickly she was married, which was unusual for someone that young, right?
Right. Within the year, at the age of 15, she was married to one of the wealthiest merchants in the colony, William Cox. And even for that time, 15 years old, to be married was very, very unusual because most women in the colonial period married at about the age of 21 to 23.
And why do you think she was married off so young? Just for the partnership? Like her father just wanted to set up this alliance with the man she married?
Well, I think the man that she married was very attracted to her. She was clearly very special. It's been recorded that she was described as lovely and accomplished. She was unusual. She was very mature for her age. And to have a man who is nearly 20 years older than her pick her among the other women in the colony, her husband that she married, William Cox, had been in Manhattan for 8 years, and he was very established. He was very wealthy. He was an elected official. He was a selectman. He's very connected in polite New York society, and he could have had anybody, but he picked Sarah.
But then that marriage was tragically short-lived. Can you talk about what happened to him?
Yes, it was tragically short-lived. They had been married 4 years, and William Cox had been sent on a mission to New Jersey to tell the colonists that there was a new monarch. There were new monarchs, William and Mary. And while he was on that mission, he drowned, stepping between his canoe onto his ship, and he drowned, unfortunately.
Yeah. So you write, well, I mean, in detail about that. So that was recorded, the events of his death. That was that in the newspaper, or just people wrote letters, people who witnessed it?
The witnesses recorded it, and it's in the primary sources. It was a very big event because he was a very established member of society. And for him to die, in this way while he was on a mission was awful. And there were people that saw the whole thing of him trying to step from his canoe to his ship, and then he lost his footing and he fell in the water, and he was wearing his finery, his brocade coat and his buckled shoes, and he sunk in the mud, and it was just tragic. It was awful.
It's just such a strange fluke because he and everybody would do that 100 times, stepping onto the boat. It's just, yeah.
You're exactly right. He would have done it 100 times in his life. It was just a fluke. It was unfortunate for sure.
And then it leaves Sarah a widow at, what is she, 19 years old?
That's right. She was widowed at 19, and her affairs were complicated because of they got caught up in bureaucracy. Her hands were tied on what she could do, and like any woman of that time, in order to get standing, it was and have legal rights, it was through her husband. So within a year, she remarried another merchant and a mariner named John Ort. He was a Dutch merchant.
And so this marriage, again, not long lasting.
Right. And it wasn't terrific either. He couldn't pay their bills. He had difficulties as a merchant, and he ran them into debt. So Sarah went from being very wealthy to being very poor. So he died. We're not sure how he died. There are no records of it. But we do know that while she was married to John Ort, she met Captain Kidd at a chance encounter. Captain Kidd was purchasing a house from her brother, Samuel Jr., who had inherited a house on Wall Street, which is the financial district of Manhattan. And he had inherited that from Sarah's first husband, William Cox. So her younger brother, is selling this house, and Captain Kidd purchased it. So she met Captain Kidd then.
People like myself, so who I read the book vaguely kind of Captain Kidd, oh, he's a pirate. Can you just contextualize for people at the time she met him? Who was Captain Kidd? What was he up to?
He was a privateer. He was a stellar member of society. He owned a great deal of property. He was a war hero because he had saved the colony from chaos that was going on during Jacob Lester's takeover of the colony. And so he was a very esteemed member of society. He was a very reputable privateer. He was very skilled as a mariner. And so when she met him, he was just this great guy. And for the record, he did not turn pirate until much, much later. And when she married him 2 days after John Ort died, he was a privateer. And the two of them were like a power couple.
Can you talk about so I just think it's so fascinating that we'll talk about what happens to Captain Kidd, but he's remembered now as this pirate. But at the time, a privateer was kind of the reverse reputation. He was doing things that we think of as pirate things, but when you're doing it for the government, then you're called a privateer. So can you just talk about the difference? Like, what was a privateer versus a pirate?
That's a great question. A privateer is, in essence, a legal pirate. A privateer, Captain Kidd, was hired by King William and the most important men in London, a number of lords, to go hunt enemy ships. And England was at war with France. So Captain Kidd was to go capture French ships, capture the ship and the cargo, and bring it back to London. Privateers were auxiliaries to the British Navy because during wartime there was a shortage of men and ships. So they hired these men who own their own ships to go and help them fight the enemy. So they are issued a legal document called a letter of marque that is a contract, and it's very specific on what the intention is. Captain Kidd was issued 2 letters of marque because he was so accomplished as a mariner. He was to act as a privateer to capture French enemy ships, and he was also to capture pirates and rid the seas of pirates that were disrupting international trade. So he was uh, a legitimate mariner. Pirates are not legitimate mariners; they're outlaws, and they do not share. They do not take the cargo back and give it to their investors. There are no investors. It's just an independent entity of the captain and his crew. And when they capture a ship, they steal the cargo and they divide the goods among themselves.
So at the time she married Captain Kidd, so he was, I just think it's so fascinating because if we're just kind of looking at the story as it happens, so she married him, and like you said, they were this power couple. He was a very well regarded, very important member of society. So she's had these debts with her previous husband, but now she's elevated, but also their relationship. Can you talk about this was a good relationship? They really loved each other.
Yes, and Captain Kidd paid off her debts, and he was able to untangle the bureaucracy with his lawyer. He was able to untangle the bureaucracy that tied up Sarah's inheritance from her first husband, William Cox. So, yes, it was a very strong relationship. And he stayed around for 5 years, working as a merchant sea captain to be near Sarah. They had 2 daughters, a little girl named Elizabeth and young Sarah. Elizabeth was born in 1692. Sarah and Captain Kidd married in May of 1691. She was 21 years old, and he was 37. And in 1692, they had Elizabeth. In 1694, they had little Sarah. So for 5 years, he was home, except when he went on his trips to Antigua to deliver goods for his merchant shipping business. But then after 5 years, he really got the itch to have a dream job, and that is to get back into serious privateering. And he wanted to be sponsored by the monarch. That was his dream job.
And so what happens next? So he starts traveling more effectively, like he's away more often.
So he promises Sarah that he will be back very soon, but he wanted the opportunity to see if he could get this dream job with the King of England and investors. So he tells Sarah, "I'll be back by Christmas," and he brings with him Sarah's younger brother, Samuel Jr., who those two have a very special relationship. Kidd is more like a big brother or an uncle to him. He mentors him and teaches him the way of being a sailor. And so he brings him with him, Samuel Jr., to London, where Captain Kidd tries to and succeeds at getting this privateering job. So he's gone for almost a year, and he comes back and he tells Sarah that he's got this great opportunity, and he promises her it's a 1-year gig. It's a 1-year job. He'll be back, and this is an opportunity of a lifetime. So he does go, and she lets him go, and they spend time together every minute before he leaves. And when he sets out on his voyage, it's just supposed to be for 1 year. That's what his contract says. But while he's at sea for a year, he doesn't find any prizes to capture. So he stays an extra year, and then he stays an extra year. And it's 3 years now. And his men are are really unhappy because they have no money to earn. They've earned no money, and they have no money to send back to their family. So things are difficult after 3 years. And the ship that he was given, a brand new ship called the Adventure Galley, is now leaking and in bad repair. And the men are mutinous, and the conditions on board are terrible. So it's a very difficult time for Captain Kidd. And his men insist that they just take any prize that they can because they are now desperate. And that's where he breaks his contract and captures ships that are not just French ships. He captures other ships too. And that's when he's considered that he turned pirate.
And so once he does that, what are the repercussions to the king who had given him this job?
Well, they keep it quiet. They don't want anybody to know, and they use Captain Kidd as a scapegoat. In the meantime, Captain Kidd comes back after 3 years to get Sarah. He is now a wanted man, and he comes back to get Sarah so that together they can plot how he can try to get pardoned from Lord Belmont, who is the governor of New York and Massachusetts. But Lord Belmont also is, he wears two hats. He's not only the governor appointed by the king, whose mission, by the way, is to stamp out piracy in the colonies, but he is also a private investor in Captain Kidd's privateering voyage, and he has a lot to gain if Captain Kidd is successful in carrying out the mission of capturing French ships. So they come back. The king keeps it quiet, and the investors keep it quiet, and Captain Kidd is really left on his own to try to save his life.
So he comes back, and he and Sarah reunite.
Yes, he comes back, and he arranges a secret rendezvous with Sarah through his lawyer to have her skirted away from Manhattan. He doesn't go into Manhattan because he knows he'll be captured. And he has her taken by ship with their children to Block Island, where he's arranged for her to stay safely with some friends of his until he can get to Block Island, which is a small island in Long Island Sound, where he will come and get her, and they will be reunited after 3 years.
So this is where what I find really compelling, and I'm sure this is part of what led you to write the book, is the fact that, like you were saying, pirates had people at home. They had loved ones, they had families, but the fact that he and she, like that they're so drawn to each other despite all of these circumstances, he's finding ways, even though it's complicated, to reunite with her because they were so in love. I find that very moving.
Yes, he risked his life to come back for her. He came all the way from the Indian Ocean back to New York. That's a long way. Mm-hmm. And it was very risky. But he wanted to be with her, and she could have known. She would have known that he was declared a pirate, and it's a very scary time. It would have put her at risk, but she didn't hesitate when she learned that he was nearby and that he had made these arrangements for her to go to Block Island. She did not hesitate. She packed up her worldly belongings, her silver, her money, packed up her children, took her maid with her to help her with the children, and did not hesitate. And that's an amazing show of devotion because it was enormously scary. She knew what happens to pirates. She put herself in harm's way because of her devotion. She absolutely believed in him, and he needed her too. He absolutely relied on her skill as street savvy and her support and her commitment to keeping their family together.
And that's just, when I think of pirates, I don't think of that side of things. I don't think of them being a devoted, like you just said, devoted to the family, devoted to the wife. I think that's such an interesting and unexpected thing for me to learn. So how did their reunion go on Block Island?
Well, it went very well. He came for her before she arrived there. When she was in transit, Captain Kidd dropped off cannon and ammunition on the front lawn of his friend's house and pointed the cannon towards the harbor, which was a signal to anyone, any of the authorities, don't mess with my wife and family. So he made arrangements to protect her and his daughters. And he did come for her. She rode on his pirate ship, she and their daughters and their maid. And she invited her friends that she was staying with. They were all on the pirate ship, sailing around Long Island Sound for a couple of days, not just having fun. Although when they reunited, Captain Kidd had made arrangements to have a feast as a form of reunion celebration of sheep. He had spices. He had rum, spices to cook the sheep, and so they had a festive reunion. And then they got down to business on how he was going to try to secure a pardon with the governor, who has moved from Manhattan to Boston to check out things in that colony.
So I like thinking that they were reunited. Obviously, they were very devoted to each other, very in love, but also she was helping him strategize, presumably, to figure out based on what she knew from having been living there for so long. Maybe she would know who her friends were, who she could maybe contact, who she could petition to maybe find support for him. Do you think that was part of their strategy?
Yes, I think she applied her natural instincts of nurturing and protecting, and I think that was her strongest suit. While they were on his boat, which was called the Saint Antonio, he received a letter via a messenger from the governor saying, "If you are as innocent as you say, come to Boston and you will be pardoned." Well, together they read that, and it just didn't ring quite true that he wouldn't put in writing a more committed, a stronger commitment for Captain Kidd. So I think what she contributed to him was her womanly instincts of, wait a minute, let's make sure that we're more secure, more safe.
Mm-hmm.
Let's write back and buy more time until we can get a clearer sense of really what's going on with things. But he relied on her for that. Absolutely needed her.
And that's where I think a lot of the strength of your book as well is you found these primary sources and you're looking at the events that happened and then kind of deducing what Sarah's role would have been in these events, given that we don't have her writings, we don't have her diaries. So we know that she and he were on the ship together. You just said they they were suspicious of this letter. So then what happened next?
So they sail, they're very suspicious, and Captain Kidd has a ship full of treasure. So he goes to Gardiner's Island, which is in Long Island Sound. So he is in Long Island Sound, picture this, at Block Island, and he sails west. It's just a few miles, it's very close, to another small island that's has a reputation as being kind of a safe harbor for mariners. And it's an island called Gardiner's Island. The lord of the manor there is named John Gardiner. And Captain Kidd asks him to keep some of his treasure for him and a few of his slaves. And also he wants to bury a trunk full of treasure on Gardiner's Island. All of this is in the primary sources because John Gardiner gave depositions about this. And John Gardner, reported that Mrs. Kidd was on the ship. Mm-hmm. So we know she was there. We know exactly where all of this transpired. We know the events. We know the goods that were buried on Gardner's Island. So Captain Kidd is making provisions to provide for his safety by offloading his treasure, because he thinks that it is a great leverage with the governor to give him a pardon. And if the governor will give him a pardon, he will tell him where all the treasure is.
Well, and I'm sure we'll get to this towards the end of the story, but one of the things that Captain Kidd is known for is having buried treasure. And where did he bury his treasure? So this is one example of him doing that we know about.
Yes, we definitely know that he buried it on Gardner's Island. And we also know that the governor found out about it and eventually it had to be returned. So here's the story. So Captain Kidd buries it on Gardner's Island. They offload all the treasure on there. And then they return to Boston, and the ship is now empty of any treasure. So Captain Kidd arrives, and after a couple of days trying to get a meeting with the governor, he is finally granted a meeting, and he is asking for a pardon. And the governor doesn't trust him and arrests him and puts him in prison there in Boston. And he's chained with 16-pound weights around his ankle and his wrists. And he's in solitary confinement. And Captain Kidd is forced to tell him about the buried treasure on Gardner's Island, of which he does. And Lord Belmont sends men to Gardner's Island and has it dug up. John Gardner, the lord of the manor, is not in any position to mess around with the governor's men, and tells him where it is buried on his property. And the governor's men dig up the trunk full of treasure and bring it back to Boston. And the other bits of treasure that were offloaded were dispersed in various ways, in various places, of which we don't really know. But the only person who would have known is Sarah.
Yeah, I just want to mention too, for people who are going to read the book, like the very opening of the book, you kind of hint towards she is the only one who knows where potentially more treasure is buried.
That's correct. There are no primary sources that say where the rest of the treasure is. There are primary sources that say it was buried on Gardner's Island. There are no primary sources that say where else it was buried. But Sarah would have known where it was all dispersed.
So where was she? What was happening to her while he was imprisoned in chains at this point? Was she also arrested, or?
Yes, she was. She was arrested as an accomplice to him, and she was put in prison too. And she was there for a period of time. We're not sure how long, but it was long enough so that she was desperate for money, because in those days, they didn't give them anything more than bread and water, and they had to pay for their own food. But Sarah had no money because her belongings had been seized when Captain Kidd was arrested. The governor's henchmen came into her lodgings and stole all her personal belongings. They took her trunk of silver and her money and all her valuables. So she had nothing, and then she was in prison with nothing. Her children are back at her lodgings, which are some friends' houses, a friend's house, and she is there all alone with no food in a prison, and her husband's somewhere in the prison a few cells away, but he doesn't know she's there, and she can't get word to him. But Captain Kidd, in his protective way of providing for Sarah, had, before he met up with her at Block Island, made a backup plan with yet another one of his friends and hid gold with him. His name was Captain Thomas Paine, who lived outside of Newport, Rhode Island. So Captain Paine is holding backup reserves for Sarah should she ever need them. So Captain Kidd was making all these provisions for Sarah for her safety in the event things went bad. And thank goodness he did, because things went very bad.
Yeah.
So she had to get these backup resources in order to have food in prison. Eventually she was released from prison because the governor had no reason to keep her. And so she was released, and then she was just waiting months and months and months and months for Captain Kidd's, hoping for his release.
I'm just thinking of where they started in their relationship as the power couple. He was this very admired member of society, and now he's in prison. They're separated, but the commitment, like, they're still, like, this is her husband, and she's just desperate to be reunited with him, I would imagine. And desperate for him to be freed. Yeah. And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
With your long-forgotten name, we call upon you.
We call upon you.
In the words of the unspeakable language, we call upon you.
We call upon you.
By the spilt blood of the wicked, who walk upon this world, sprouting the words of false idols, we call upon you.
We call upon you.
On the land of the dead harvest, that which brings the earth itself into your service, Yamal, we call upon you.
We call upon you. We call upon you. We call upon you.
Yamal calls upon you.
The Sprouting, a Call of Cthulhu actual play podcast by Blighthouse Studio. Find us on your podcatcher of choice.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
I'm Brennan Storr.
I'm Paul Bestall.
We're the Ghost Story Guys.
And every 2 weeks, we explore first-person stories of encounters with the paranormal from all around the world.
Then we have some fun reacting to those stories. We like to say our goal is to scare the hell out of you, then make you laugh.
Belief in the paranormal is not required. All you need is a love of great storytelling and curiosity about the world around you.
Come find the Ghost Story Guys on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else fine podcasts live, or at ghoststoryguys.com.
And we're back.
Absolutely. And she she sends 2 petitions to the governor. One of them is politely demanding that the governor return her personal belongings that were seized because it's all she has to live on. And they were returned to her, which is really interesting. So she did get her silver back and her money back. The second petition she sent 3 petitions while Kid was in prison. First one was give me my stuff back, which they did. The second one was let me go visit my husband. He's in need of his wife's affection.
Mm.
And the governor did not grant that. And then the third one was we're now into the dead of winter in Boston. And of course, there's no heat in this. This is 1699. Boston's prison is just a hellhole. And he has only the clothes that he had when he was chained and imprisoned months ago. We're going on 8 or 9 months now. And he's freezing. He's absolutely freezing. And so she petitions the governor to let her bring him blankets and warm clothes. And he doesn't let her do that. But the authorities in London are worried that Captain Kidd is going to die in prison because of the conditions. So they make allowances for him to be given blankets so that he will stay alive.
So what is the intent? Why do they want him to stay alive? They're waiting for him to have a trial, or what is the end goal for them?
They do want to have a trial. Lord Belmont wants him to be tried for piracy in Massachusetts. But the laws of Massachusetts at the time didn't allow pirates to be tried. They had to be sent to London to be tried there. So they are trying to keep him alive so that he can be tried for his crimes. He is eventually put on a ship. His treasure is put on a ship. The treasure that was dug up from Gardiner's Island is put on a ship. His ship, the San Antonio, is taken also. And these all go across the Atlantic to London. In addition, Kidd's men, who were his crew, are arrested and taken with him to London. So he is there imprisoned again in solitary confinement for over a year, awaiting trial.
And that goes, I think, somewhat famously very badly for him.
It does. And at this point, he is starting to go mad because he is physically so worn down and so emotionally worn down from being in solitary confinement in chains in Boston for almost a year, and then in London in the same conditions for another year. So the man's spirit is just depleted. He does manage to write some amazing letters defending himself. But you also see from his handwriting and from what he writes that he is now a desperate, desperate man pleading for his life. And by the way, his evidence is gone missing conveniently. So it's very difficult for him to defend himself. He also was given lawyers, but not enough legal representation. So it was really unfair, the conditions under which he was tried.
He really had no chance. Like, it was, the ending was predetermined. This was a trial that the people, his enemies, wanted him to be found guilty.
Yes. Yes. The trial documents are very, very interesting, but they're also, I found them hard to read. Hard to read meaning it was just so sad to hear it all going on. But that's because I really thought Captain Kidd was a decent man. I didn't think he was how they made him out to be as like this monster. I didn't see him that way. He was tried not only for piracy, he was tried for murder too. And what happened there was that on the third year, when the men were in desperate situations, and they were very, very mutinous, and one of his crew members, who is the gunner, meaning he ran the cannon, mouthed off to Captain Kidd. And a captain of a ship just cannot have disrespect and insolence among his crew members. And in the 17th century, what captains did to their crews on a good day may not have been the best of things. Some of the punishment was very harsh. Anyway, so this gunner mouths off to Captain Kidd, and Captain Kidd gets angry because, of course, he's in straits, also desperate to try to save his ship that's leaking and to capture prizes to appease his men and his investors and the king in England. So the gunner who mouths off, Captain Kidd hits him with a wooden bucket on the head, and the guy dies the next day. So then he's accused of being a murderer, but it wasn't premeditated. It was an act of anger and disciplining the insolent crew member. So Captain Kidd is now tried for murder and piracy, and he was found guilty of murder. And so then his fate was sealed. Then once you have one conviction, there's no way you're going to get out of that one. So he was tried for murder, and then he was found guilty of piracy also.
And where was Sarah while all this trial was happening in England?
She had left Boston when he was put on a ship to go to London, and she returned home to New York, to her home. She lived on the corner of Pearl Street and Hanover Street in the Hanover Square area of Manhattan, which is now the financial district of Manhattan. So she returned to her home there, waiting, thinking that he would be found not guilty, and at the same time hoping that he would be pardoned, because the king issued a proclamation pardoning pirates. He was trying to rid the seas of pirates, and this happened a couple of times, that the king issued pardons. And this pardon, Sarah was really hopeful would apply to Captain Kidd, but the king specifically named that Captain Kidd would not be in the broad pardon of pirates.
And so he was found guilty and was put to death, right?
Yes, he was hanged on the River Thames, and his body was left in chains for years as a reminder to anyone who would think of turning pirate, to let them know it was a terrible idea.
And so where does this leave Sarah, other than devastated? But she's again widowed, still quite young. What does she do?
Well, she waits. It takes several weeks for her to learn that Captain Kidd's been found guilty and that he's been executed. And when she gets the news, the authorities in New York come and confiscate everything from her. So she loses her home, her properties, and all her personal belongings. And she's destitute, and she's a social outcast.
This is part of what I find so compelling about your book and just this story, is the way her fortunes, just like things are good and then they're terrible and then they're good again, like just the swings that she is dealing with. So she's again destitute, but she's a resilient person, certainly. And so what does she do?
So she mourns Captain Kidd for 2 years, and she has got to figure out what to do. And she does what she needs to do. She remarries, And with the help of her father, she remarries an East Jersey merchant named Christopher Rousby. And with the help of her father, she's able to offer a dowry, which is some property that she had, what was in Captain Kidd's name, as all property was. It was in a man's name. And she has her father, she has her father take the property and give it to Christopher Rousby. So it's a nice arrangement. She and Christopher Rousby get married. And in order to be made whole again, to regain all her properties that she lost as a pirate's wife, she is restored by Queen Anne, who is now the new monarch after King William fell off a horse. And so she is restored. She is saved by a woman. Queen Anne saved her. And Queen Anne must have had enormous empathy for her, because at the time that Sarah sent a petition to the Queen asking for the Queen to restore her, it took 6-8 weeks for a letter to cross the Atlantic in a ship, if it got there at all. And the Queen, within 2 or 3 months, restored her, made it legal again for her to have all her properties. So Sarah again has reinvented herself. She's made whole again. She has a new name. She's now Sarah Rousby. She's not Sarah Kidd. Her two daughters take on Rousby's name. And she has a long and successful marriage with Christopher Rousby. They were married 25 years, and she has 3 sons with him. And one of them she names William, which could be in memory of Captain Kidd.
And she lives for that era, quite a long life, to 74, is it?
Yes, which is a very, very long life. It's a good long life now.
Yeah. I mean, just considering everything, it's such a fascinating story. I see why when you first encountered her, you thought, oh, this needs to be its own book. This can't just be a chapter in another book.
Yes, because we all think of the story of Captain Kidd, but no one knows that behind Captain Kidd was this very strong woman.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes him a three-dimensional figure. We often think of pirates as just these one-dimensional sea rogues who are cutthroats and steal, but we see him now in a new light. And I really wanted to set history straight, to bring her into the light, to give her credit where credit was due.
And I think details like you mentioned, well, on this podcast, but also in the book, like the fact that they were friends, like they knew each other, they became quite good friends before they even got married, like while she was still married to her second husband. The fact they got married, what was it, 2 days after that husband passed away? Like it speaks to, I think often when I think of people in this era, you think about arranged marriages, or you think about people who maybe are forced into it or something. But these were 2 people who really liked each other, got married, and just had this really strong partnership. And I think that's also worth bringing to the forefront.
Yes, it's a compelling tale. It's about love and marriage, motherhood and survival. She was a tremendously resilient woman, who could overcome adversities. And the part that I found really interesting was that she arrived in New York only with her father and 2 brothers. She didn't have her mother. Her mother, we don't know when her mother passed away. There's no primary sources to inform when Sarah lost her. But Sarah went through all of these tragedies alone, and she just had to keep figuring it out. And I think her ability to recover from tragedies and to reinvent herself and to keep figuring it out, but she also did it within the strictures of 17th and 18th century society, which were very limited on women. They had no legal identity. They were all based, their whole being was based on a man, through a man. But Sarah was able to navigate herself through the limitations to create a life for herself, which in the end was very successful. And she restored herself. She died. Her will shows that she had all her properties. She had five children that survived to adulthood. And that in itself is amazing because so many women died in childbirth. So Sarah not only was physically strong, living to the age of 74, she was physically strong, surviving childbirth and surviving five pregnancies, and her children lived to adulthood. I mean, she's an amazing woman with a character that is really worth bringing to the forefront of empowering women who have tragedies, but you can pick yourself up and keep going, which is what Sarah Kidd did.
And I think just the fact that her character comes through so strongly, despite not having her diaries, despite not just the evidence that you were able to find, it's enough to put together. We can see what kind of a person she was just based on the evidence that was left behind. Like, that was how strong her character was, that it comes
That's
through
right.
just from,
That's right. And we don't know what she looked like. There are no portraits of her. There's a portrait of Captain Kidd, but there's no portrait of Sarah Kidd. But we know she was married 4 times, so she was very attractive. We know that she was described as lovely and accomplished. And we know so much about her by the events that happened, which there's a real track record of where she was, what she did, who she was with, people who saw her. I first met Sarah Kidd, learned who she was through 2 colonial governors who were referring to Captain Kidd and referred to her not by name, but by saying, one of them said, Captain Kidd will be going on a privateering voyage if his wife will let him. And I thought, who is she?
Yeah.
I want to know who she is. And then Lord Belmont, when they were in Boston and Captain Kidd was in prison, Lord Belmont says, the authorities in London say, why did you take so long to arrest Captain Kidd? Because he was at large for 6 days in Boston before he was arrested. And the authorities in London said, why'd you take so long? And he said, because he brought his wife and children with him, and I knew he would not forsake them.
So those details are stunning because they really say so much about her and about the relationship. And it's just not things you think about when you think of Captain Kidd, the famous pirate. Like you were saying, it really makes him a 3-dimensional person.
Right. And the thing that is really interesting is that the people around him and the people around her all recognized this very special relationship that they had. It was evident. They must have stood close to each other or showed some sort of affection, because it was very evident, enough that it was mentioned by 2 colonial governors. And it was written in primary sources.
So the last part of this podcast is just a thing I do at the end of all the episodes, we score the different women we talk about on this podcast in different categories, just to kind of see, not to compare them against each other, but just how people fall in different categories. And I have some ideas about where Sarah's going to fall. The first category is what we call scandalousness. So how, to the people of her time, if you're thinking on a scale of 0 to 10, how, and this is hard because there was periods of her time where she was shunned where she was the pirate's wife, but then she dusted herself off and became a respected member of society again. So on a scale of 0 to 10, how scandalous do you think she was?
Well, you're quite right that the different stages in her life, at some point in her life, she would have been considered scandalous when she lost everything, and her husband was a convicted pirate. That would have been scandalous. So I would have given her a 10 for that, as far as being scandalous. She, at the time, she was the only woman in Manhattan that was the wife of a convicted pirate. And she was the only woman who had lost everything she owned because of her association with him. So I would say that's a 10. But I would think on the other times of the other 3 marriages, I would say she was a 10 with Captain Kidd on the last part of their marriage. The first 5 years, they were
right. Yeah,
she was not. And then for her other 3 marriages, I would say that she was a 0.
Yeah, and I mean, for the last 25 years of her life, she's very respected. So I'll average that out to a 5, maybe. Which is funny. I don't think I've ever had someone on the show who like veered so extremely, but she did.
Right.
The next category is, we call it scheminess, which really just means like, and I think you're talking a lot about this, the resourcefulness. Like when they're backed up in a corner, how clever are they? How are they able to figure out, how smart was she, basically? And I think this would be a high score.
Oh, definitely. When she was, and we see that in the period when she is in Boston, she's a 10. She should be a 25. But
yeah,
she is showing her deep depth of love, commitment, resourcefulness to protect her husband and her family.
The fact that I've had other women I've talked about on the show who fell into poverty or unfortunate circumstances, and they were never able to get out of it. But the fact that she did at least twice really speaks to how just kind of indomitable she was, how smart she was, how clever she was. Yeah.
I love that you use the word indomitable. That's the word that I think of too. She had skills. She knew how to persuade. She knew how to hustle. She knew how to survive. Her greatest strengths were her courage, her commitment, and her love. But to get back to scheminess, I think she was schemy in ways that were appropriate for the time. I mean, it's not like she went and hurt anybody. She worked within the confines of what she had, but she was trying to figure out. She even tried to figure out how to get Captain Kidd out of prison and how to be sweet to the guard. And I don't mean sweet meaning in a sexual way. She was charming. She was without a doubt very charming and very persuasive. So scheminess, she knew how to use her skills.
Yeah. And again, I think it's so stunning that comes across even with so little primary source information about her. Like, it was so strong, her scheminess, that it's evident even through just a few documents.
Right. Well, yes, but there are a lot of documents about her time in Boston that are left. So I knew the details of her time in Boston, not only from the petitions that she sent, but from the court documents and the council member documents. There's a lot of information that surround her that show her character.
Well, and I guess that's the other thing too. I've been saying there's so little evidence, but you're right. There were many things you're able to look at, but I think compared to other women of that era, there's so much more. Like, there's so many other wives of merchants we don't know about. So the fact that she did make herself it just shows the effect she had on everyone around her. The fact that we know as much as we do.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Which leads me to the next category, which is significance. So this is within what she did. How much of an effect did she leave behind on people who knew her or on the events that were happening around her? What's her significance to history, do you think?
I think her because no one knew anything about her. No one knew she was in history.
Mm-hmm.
I think in her period, in her time, the significance was to her family, and that would be a 10 because she was so devoted and so protective of them and provided for them that the significance is on her immediate family, her 5 children, her grandchildren that she provided for, and for the future generations. Her church was Trinity Church on Wall Street in Manhattan, and Captain Kidd helped build the church, and they had a pew there, and the records show that she continued to use the pew and worship there many years after he died, and she is buried there, I believe, and her son and grandson are buried there, and her children her offspring and the future generations continued to use Trinity Church until the 1800s. So her significance, I would say, is on her family, and she passed on her sense of values, family values. She was very religious, very, very religious, attending this Anglican church, Trinity Church. So the significance, I would give her a 10 for her immediate family. And now that this book has brought her into the light, I think it's a book of empowerment for men and women, that they can see how relationships can work together. And so I think that she is a 10 in history.
And then the final category is, I describe it as the sexism bonus. It's kind of for women who could have done more, if not for the state of women in the world, to give them some more points if they need them. I think certainly like the fact that she couldn't own her own property, she couldn't have her own money, would have gotten in her way. But I would argue that she did very well for herself, considering how few rights women had. She found ways around that, like by finding a new husband, by finding ways to leverage her power. So I'm not sure how much more she could have done. I don't know. It's a complicated thing to think of with her, because she was successful, like you were saying, within her own life, within her family, within that world. I'm not sure what more she could have done if she had been able to own her own property, things like that.
That's right. I agree with you. I think that's very a clear understanding of the situation. If it was sexism, it was just that she had the limitations. It was called femme covert. It was that she married women couldn't own property, and their standing was through their husband, and they had no legal rights. So the sexism was that men controlled women. She was the property of her husband. So that sexism part would have been a 10. But you're absolutely right. She managed to work around it and was very successful. So she didn't really let the sexism bother her too much. She worked with it.
Yeah, she found ways around it. Like, it would have been like if after her second husband died, if she was destitute and was never able to pull herself out of it, then that would have been like, oh, because of women's place in the world. But she found ways to continuously do that. So I think I would give her a low score for that, just because that didn't get in her way. I'll give her, I don't know, a 2 maybe.
I agree with you. I think 2 is perfect.
Yeah. So that gives her a total of 27, which I'm going to say is on the scale of people who are on this podcast, it's a lot of people fall in that range, because that's why I have the 4 categories. Some people score high in some and lower in some. It's rare for somebody to score high in everything. But I love that you've brought her to the forefront. I love that you wrote this biography of her. So, The Pirate's Wife, the remarkable true story of Sarah Kidd. Is there anything else? I think you've talked so beautifully about the importance of her story and about the book. Is there any final thoughts you want to share with the listeners about her importance, about why you feel this book is important?
I think it's important because it reveals that Sarah was easily as interesting and remarkable as her famous husband.
Mm-hmm.
And I think she's a woman that we can appreciate why Captain Kidd loved her and why 4 men married her. And I think it's just at the end of the story, I was so sad when she died because I wanted to know what she would do next, because I was so taken by her strength and her courage, her commitment, and her fierce devotion.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing this story. I could not recommend your book more. I think it's such an important book, but I also think it's it's narrative nonfiction. Like it reads almost like a novel at times. So it's very much, I would imagine your intent was for people with no knowledge of the story can just pick it up and learn the story without having to know about the history of piracy. I'm assuming that's
yes.
The readership you're thinking of? Yeah.
Yes. I wanted to write it for a general audience of men and women of all ages. And I wrote it intentionally to be easily read, not as an academic piece, not as an intense maritime history piece, but as the love story that it is.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Daphne.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I really enjoyed our conversation.
So I didn't mention in the episode, but you can keep up with Daphne and what she's up to at her website, which is DaphnePalmerGeanacopoulos.com. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And I really recommend reading this book. It's such an interesting story. And it's really, as she explained on this episode, trying to bring forward this woman whose life story was so interesting and so fascinating, but also to add a bit more 3-dimensionality to the figures of Captain Kidd and other pirates who are often just seen kind of one-dimensionally. I want to also say, so Sarah Kidd's final score was a 27, which is like, that's a popular score on this podcast. Some other notable people who have a 27. I just wanted to include, so Saeed Al-Hurra, who is the first pirate-related person we talked about on this podcast, also has a 27, as do, so Jean de la Motte from the Affair of the Necklace has a 27. Ana de Mendoza with the eye patch. She was not a pirate, but it's a pirate adjacent thing. So she's in good company with a 27 on this scale. And I realized after I posted the episode a couple weeks ago about Lola Montez that I forgot to record saying what her total was. So Lola Montez, the Irish grifter, her total score was 23, which is in very good company of other people who Allison Epstein has also joined me in episodes to talk about. Catalina de Arauso has a 23.5. Christopher Marlowe has a 22.5. So that's where Lola fell on this scale. And you can, I don't know, I've got like a silly different thing to say to you as we wrap up this episode. So first of all, as per ever, if you want to give me some feedback or some notes or suggest somebody for a future episode, there's a link where you can do that at vulgarhistory.com. I also want to let you know at that same link, which is where you can send me messages with like holiday gift giving coming up soon, like Christmas and Hanukkah and Kwanzaa and all different things. And if you want to, as a gift, give somebody an audio recording of me saying, Happy Hanukkah to your friend or whatever, I'm totally open to do that. I did that for somebody, and then I was like, I could do this for other people if you want to do that as a gift. It's not like, it's like what Cameo is, except it's just me doing a voice recording and not a video. And it's just, you can ask me about that through my website if you want to do that. Also, please note, in terms of gift giving or just like self gift giving, there's all new merch available on the merch store. So we've just passed the 3-year anniversary of Vulgar History, and which is really exciting. And could never have imagined that the show would reach as many people as it has in so many countries as it has. And so to celebrate this landmark, I got an artist who's Deborah Wong, who actually created the image that you see of me in the podcast, the me, my face on Queen Elizabeth. She did that beautiful Photoshop job. She created 4 pieces of art that I got her to do based on 4 kind of iconic people from Vulgar History episodes. So there's one for Empress Sisi, there's one for Frances Howard, there's one for Catalina de Arauso, and there's one for Hortense Mancini. And each of them, it's a beautiful drawing that she's done, which is sort of inspired by what the person's story was like, kind of what the discussion about them was like in Vulgar History. So for instance, on the Catalina de Arauso, it's her famous face with her Lord Farquaad haircut. But she's sitting on, it's like she's riding a llama, but the image looks like a playing card, which is what playing cards look like when Catalina was running around grifting people at card games and stabbing them. And then Hortense Mancini's, it's her famous portrait. It's based on a famous portrait of her, famous to us, with her Sailor Moon buns and the flowers, but she's all surrounded by flowers. And that kind of shows how she, through the face of great challenges, so many adversity she faced in life, but she kept beautifully blooming and through it like a beautiful flower. The Empress Sisi one, it's partially the famous portrait of Sisi with the stars in her hair, but it's like that's half of it. And the other half is a horse just kind of like running wild with the mane of hair, just to show like Sisi is seen so much as this beautiful person who, famously wearing the really tight corset and stuff, but really on the inside and who she wanted to be and who she really was in her soul was this horse girl who loved growing up just free in the woods. And then the final portrait is, of course, Frances Howard, who was one of the muses for why I ended up doing this podcast in the first place. So it's a beautiful drawing of her and her famous tits out portrait. And underneath it says tits out, but in like oldie time English script using the language. And I did consult with people who know about this stuff, how you would have said and written tits out in the 17th century when she lived. So it says like titties outies. Anyways, that's all available at vulgarhistory.store. If you're going to be shopping there, remember you can use code TITSOUT for free US shipping or TITSOUT10 for 10% off. You can also follow me on social media. I'm on Instagram at vulgarhistorypod. Also, I've started doing TikTok. So on TikTok at vulgarhistory. As I record this, Twitter is slowly imploding as a thing. So by the time this is released, like God knows what's going on there. But anyway, Twitter at vulgarhistory. And if you want to support the podcast as well, you can support me at patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. So if you join for at least $1 a month, you get early ad-free access to all the episodes. And then if you pledge at least $5 a month, then you get access to the Patreon limited other series. So Vulgar Piece Theater, where I talk with Lana Wood Johnson and Alison Epstein about costume dramas. Most recently, Queen Margot, my favorite movie of all time. I also talk about, this Asshole episodes are on there. The most recent one I've done there. Genghis Khan, which was voted on by the Patreons. So when you're there as well, sometimes there's polls you can help me choose what to talk about. Anyway, that's my long rambling end of things. But basically, The Pirate's Wife, The Remarkable True Story of Sarah Kidd, great book, super recommend. And until next time, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Ann Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Welcome to the small town of Chinook, where faith runs deep and secrets run deeper. In this new thriller, religion and crime collide when a gruesome murder rocks the isolated Montana community. Everyone is quick to point their fingers at a drug-addicted teenager, but local deputy Ruth Vogel isn't convinced. She suspects connections to a powerful religious group. Enter federal agent V.B. Laureau, who has been investigating a local church for possible criminal activity. The pair form an unlikely partnership to catch the killer, unearthing secrets that leave Ruth torn between her duty to the law, her religious convictions, and her very own family. But something more sinister than murder is afoot, and someone is watching Ruth. Chinook, starring Kelly Marie Tran and Sanaa Lathan. Listen to Chinook wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, a founder of the Go Kid Go network. At Go Kid Go, putting kids first is at the heart of every show that we produce. That's why we're so excited to introduce a brand new show to our network called The Search for the Silver Lining, a fantasy adventure series about a spirited young girl named Isla who time travels to the mythical land of Camelot. Look for The Search for the Silver Lining on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.